Welcome to the flight levels. You're about to go make a cross-country flight in your airplane or the one that you've just rented. Now, most pilots fly at 75% power, but you of course have the option of setting anything you want. Today, we're going to go through when you might want to fly at a lower power setting than you're used to, or maybe when you want to fly at a higher power setting than you're used to, and why the winds aloft forecast should absolutely influence this decision. Let's get to it. But before we dive in, I want to be clear about who this video is for. If you are exclusively renting airplanes and paying by the Hobbs meter, this isn't for you at all. Because the reality is, you pay the exact same amount no matter what your fuel flow rate is. So if you're renting an airplane, go to max continuous power, which is probably 75% in most GA airplanes, and call it a day. However, if you are an airplane owner and you're paying for your own gas, every gallon saved adds up over time, and this video is absolutely for you. Now, one other thing to get out of the way is if your absolute goal was to fly with the best miles per gallon, then you want to fly at the speed of L over D max. Now, the problem with L over D max is it's pretty slow, and the whole point of flying an airplane is getting places. So today we're going to be reasonable and talk about normal power settings that most people use, and the winds aloft turns out to be a key variable in deciding which power setting you want to use. So here we have the spreadsheet that I created with power settings from a Piper Archer ranging from 55% power all the way to 75% power. And I computed the nautical miles per gallon against the wind components all the way from a 20 knot tailwind all the way to a 20 knot headwind. And these figures are based on the Archer cruising at 8,000 feet, which arguably is a typical cruise altitude for this airplane. And then at the very bottom, I want you to notice a percentage, and this is the percentage difference between the lowest and highest power settings at each wind component. We're going to come back to this number throughout this film. So let's take a look by starting at the tailwind end of the chart at 20 knots. So if we have a low power setting, that's going to give us about 115 knots of ground speed, resulting in a fuel economy of 14.7 nautical miles per gallon. Now, if we push our power up to 75% power, ground speed, of course, rises and we can get 135 knots of ground speed, but our fuel economy drops down to about 13 nautical miles per gallon. And this results in a fuel economy penalty of almost 15%. So hold on to that number for a minute. Now, if we go to the other end of the spectrum of a 20 knot headwind, a low power setting is going to give you a ground speed of 75 knots, which I realize is terrible. Why would we do this? And a fuel economy of 9.6 nautical miles per gallon. But if we push that power setting up, we can get our ground speed up to 95 knots, but our fuel economy only drops down to 9 nautical miles per gallon. Not that much, a penalty of only about 6%. And the point here is that the economy penalty of flying at a higher power setting is cut nearly in half when you're in a headwind. But let's take a look at what this actually means on a real trip. Back to power settings in just a moment. If you're a student working toward a new pilot certificate, you need to go to checkride.flight-levels.com and try the free demo with a DPE who simulates taking your Checkride. When you answer the questions, they don't just respond with that was correct or not, they probe deeper into each question using the power of AI. Be sure to try out the free demo at checkride.flight-levels.com or find us on the Apple App Store. You're gonna love it. So let's apply this to a real life example. So let's use that Archer, 8,000 feet, and let's do a approximately 400 nautical mile trip, which is essentially the distance between San Diego and San Francisco. And let's compare doing high power versus low power with a headwind or a tailwind. So let's start with that tailwind again. If we go on that low power setting and we have that ground speed of only 115 knots, it's going to take us about 3.5 hours, and we're going to burn about 27 gallons. Not too bad. If we go to that higher power setting and really go fast, we're going to get obviously a faster ground speed of 135 knots. And it will get us there faster in about 3 hours, and we will burn 31 gallons. So we did get there a half hour faster, but we burned 4 extra gallons. And with avgas, depending on where you are in the country, hovering around $7 a gallon, that's $28. And you can decide if that's significant enough. Now, let's flip this around. Let's say that you have the unfortunate task of flying this 400-mile trip with a 20-knot headwind. I realize that's a bad day, but follow with me here. So if we decide to bring that power back to 55% power, and we're only doing that 75 knots, it's going to take us 5 hours, 20 minutes, and we're going to burn almost 42 gallons. But if we crank that power up to that high power setting, we are going to get up to 95 knots ground speed, and we're going to cut that trip time down to 4 hours and 13 minutes, and we're only going to burn 44 gallons. So with this headwind, we're now saving 67 minutes. That's over an hour, but we're only burning 2.5 gallons extra. You're only paying $18 extra on this trip to go at that higher power setting. So let's put those two results side by side, because this is the point I'm trying to make. So when you're flying with this extreme tailwind, that higher power setting did save you a half hour, but it cost you 4 gallons. With the headwind, that higher power setting saved you over an hour. It saves you double, and you only had to burn 2.5 gallons. With these normal cruise power settings, your true airspeed envelope is fixed. For the Archer at 8,000 feet, you're working with roughly between 95 knots and 115 knots true airspeed. And that's the whole menu you have available, just 20 knots to play with, no matter what the wind is doing. And also locked in with this envelope is a fixed fuel flow. You have about 2.7 gallons per hour separating the 55% power all the way to the 75% power every single time. The engine doesn't negotiate with you. So the question you have is, what does the wind do with the value of those 20 knots and 2.5 gallons per hour? So to illustrate this point a little bit better, here is a bar chart with each bar is the total ground speed at a given wind component. The solid bottom is your base ground speed at the lowest power setting, and then the lighter segment on the top is the 20 knot true airspeed envelope, what you gain by going all the way up to 75% power. So let's take a look at that tailwind side. The bars are very tall, and that top segment is a thin slice of a large bar. The wind has inflated your ground speed, so those 20 knots only buy you a small fraction of your total progress. But if we go to the other extreme on the headwind side, the total bar is shorter, but that top segment is that same 20 knots. Now it's just a much larger slice of that smaller bar. The whole point of flying an airplane is to get places faster. So honestly, in most situations, flying at max continuous power of 75% is exactly where most pilots should be. But if you have a tailwind of 10 knots or more, you do have meaningful economy to gain by reducing your power. So if we look at that chart, at a 10 knot tailwind, the penalty you're paying for going to that higher power setting is 13%. The wind is doing real work for you. You can let that happen. But on the headwind side, the math increasingly favors going to that higher power setting. If you just have a 10 knot headwind, that penalty for going to the higher power setting is now only 9%. And that ground speed is hurting at that lower setting. So push that power up if you have a headwind. So as a practical rule, if you have a tailwind of 10 knots or more, you should pull back the power. The wind is earning its keep. If the winds are light, fly your normal cruise power setting. It's probably working just fine for you. If you have a headwind of 10 knots or more, you should absolutely push the power up if you haven't already. You're getting a meaningful return on that investment in your fuel. For comparison's sake, I made the same chart with a turbo Centurion at its cruise altitude of about 12,000 feet. So the question is, does a faster airplane feel headwinds any less? Well, a headwind does decrease the ground speed by the same amount, but I would argue that it does feel the effects of the headwind substantially less. If we go back to the stacked bar chart and look at the Centurion compared to the Archer, the Centurion's speed envelope is 40 knots, which is double what the Archer's is. And the Centurion also sits on top of a much taller base, so as a fraction of total ground speeds, the two airplanes are surprisingly similar, but where the Centurion's speed advantage actually shows up is in time. Let's compare the Archer with the Turbo Centurion on that same 400 nautical mile trip, comparing it between a zero wind trip to one with a 20 knot headwind, and see how they fare. So for the Archer at 65% power, its ground speed is going to drop from 108 knots down to 88 knots, and its trip time is going to increase from 3 hours 42 minutes all the way to 4.5 hours. So that 20 knot headwind would cost the Archer about 51 minutes. But over on the Centurion at 65% power, their ground speed is going to go from 175 knots down to 155, and their 2 hour 17 minute trip becomes 2 hours 35 minutes. It's only adding 18 extra minutes for the Centurion. The same wind over the same distance, the Archer is penalized almost 3 times as heavily. A 20 knot headwind is about 19% of the Archer's true airspeed, but for the Centurion, it's only about 11%. The faster you fly, the smaller a fraction any fixed headwind takes from you. The wind doesn't change what it costs to run your engine. It only changes what you get for it. In a headwind, that fixed fuel cost buys you a large chunk of your ground speed. On the other hand, in a tailwind, it doesn't buy you that much. It's only a small fraction because the wind's already given you a big chunk for free. What do you guys think? Do you change your power settings based on the winds aloft? Do you change your power settings for other reasons? Let me know in the comments. My name's Joe. I'm a flight instructor and former air traffic controller. Be sure to check out flight-levels.com, and remember, don't just fly, climb to the flight levels. If you enjoyed this video, click here to find out more about who is Joe and what the heck I'm doing here. You're gonna love it.